Welcome to my presentation on understanding learning disabilities. This presentation is intended for both pre-service teachers as well as in-service teachers as a refresher course on the current knowledge regarding understanding learning disabilities. Today's classrooms bring us face-to-face with the reality that we as educators are expected to deal with more diverse student populations than ever before. Within this diverse group are a number of students with exceptionalities. I don't know about you, but when I first began teaching, I still taught in a time when students with exceptionalities were removed from their classroom for one-on-one or small group interventions. Increasingly, that is becoming not the case, and it is up to the classroom teacher to meet the needs of every student in each class. What are learning disabilities? Learning disabilities are a group of disorders that have a negative impact on learning. They can affect the ability to speak, listen, think, read, write, spell, or compute. Learning disabilities are distinct from global intellectual deficiency. They are a result from impairments in one or more processes related to perceiving, thinking, remembering, or learning. Learning disabilities have a real range in severity. They can be mild, moderate, or severe, and they can affect any or several areas of an individual's life. Not only can they affect many dimensions of life, but they are lifelong. An individual with a learning disability cannot cure it. They can only learn how they best learn, and they can only learn to learn alongside their learning disability. Learning disabilities are neurobiological and/or genetic in origin. While at times researchers and the public may have a difficulty deciding on what learning disabilities are, there is definitely a consensus on which learning disabilities are not. Learning disabilities are not intellectual disabilities. Quite often, a person with a learning disability has average to above average intelligence. Learning disabilities are not impairments related to sensory domains such as vision or hearing. An individual who is blind or an individual who is deaf does not necessarily have a learning disability. Learning disabilities are also not impairments related to motor impairments. Although these can be sometimes found together, a motor impairment in its own is not a learning disability. Learning disabilities are not emotional disturbances. Learning disabilities are not autism spectrum disorders. And learning disabilities are not problems that result primarily from cultural, environmental, or economic disadvantage. Learning disabilities affect the brain's ability to receive, process, store, respond, and communicate. The way that a learning disability may present itself in the classroom can be as varied as the learning disabilities that exist. For example, if a student has an impairment related to language processing, they may have difficulties in understanding jokes or taking another person's perspective. They may not be able to think through long or complex sentence structures. They may have difficulty retrieving their vocabulary and orally presenting tasks. And they may have difficulty with new vocabulary, especially when asked explicitly by the teacher. A student with a phonological processing impairment may confuse sound sequencing in words. They lack comprehension in content because they don't have fluency in their decoding. They have a hard time retaining sound symbol correspondence. And they may have a real difficulty with main concepts because they have invested so much focus into the decoding level of text. A student with a visual spatial processing deficit may have difficulty with oral or written directions for an activity. They may have a hard time identifying main ideas. They may have difficulty with the understanding of left and right or keeping them straight, as well as north and south. And they may have poor integration of sequential information, such as days of the week. An individual with a processing speed impairment may have poor social interactions, and they may not be able to keep up with fast-paced classroom lessons. They may be able to make very few connections between pieces of information within texts. They may be slow to link new information with information that has been previously learned. And they may not be able to cover the amount of material that a similar classmate could. Or to cover that same material, they're going to take a lot more time and need a great deal more effort. A student with a memory impairment may have very few strategies for trying to remember content or concepts. Spelling is likely to not be automatic, and they will likely have difficulty with writing. They'll have a hard time retrieving previously learned information, and they may be the student who forgets spelling words immediately after a test and who have difficulty with any new learning. A student with an impairment in executive functions may have poor recognition of the value of planning. The teacher may sometimes describe them as impulsive. They may have difficulty problem solving and understanding the consequences of their actions and decisions. They may have difficulty linking new with previously integrated knowledge and very few strategies for doing it. And they may have difficulty in the higher levels of learning, but yet retain isolated pieces of knowledge. Learning disabilities are a group of disorders that include dyslexia. Dyslexia is a language processing disability that is often characterized by difficulties with accurate word recognition, decoding, and spelling. Difficulties on a phonological level lead to further difficulties with vocabulary and fluency. This makes sense in that if a student has to work so greatly to decode that they will miss comprehension, they will miss main understandings because the effort that's being expended just to decode the words. Another learning disability, known as dyscalculia, involves both visual spatial difficulties, which is trouble processing what the eye sees, and language processing difficulties, which is trouble processing and making sense of what the ear hears, but always in relation to math. Dysgraphia is a writing disability affecting both motor and information processing skills, in which individuals may have trouble organizing letters, numbers, and words on a line or page. Dyspraxia, although not a learning disability in itself, dyspraxia often coexists with other learning disabilities. Individuals with dyspraxia have trouble planning and completing fine motor tasks. And executive function. Individuals with learning disabilities involving executive function have difficulty performing activities such as planning, organizing, strategizing, paying attention to and remembering details, and managing time and space. Here is a list of indicators that a student may be affected by a learning disability. Within reading, a student that might be affected by a learning disability may have difficulty with comprehension, especially with longer sentences and longer passages. They may have difficulty understanding and identifying individual sounds that make up a word. They may have difficulty associating letters to their sounds and blending all the sounds together to produce a word. And they may have difficulty with fluency and automaticity. In writing, a student that might be affected by a learning disability may have a slower writing speed. A student that may be affected by a learning disability in their writing may have handwriting that is so disjointed that it is often completely illegible. A student that might be affected by a learning disability in writing will likely show difficulty with their spelling, grammar, and their vocabulary. And a student that might be affected by a learning disability in writing might show difficulty getting a piece of writing organized. Within oral language, a student that may have a learning disability may have difficulty speaking to others using expressive language, and they may have difficulty understanding verbal explanations, discussions, or the language of others, or receptive language. They may have difficulty following fast-paced conversations, especially in groups, and they may have difficulty thinking, planning, and organizing through their own thought processes. Some indicators that a student may be affected by a learning disability in math include difficulty in computation, difficulty in understanding word problems, and difficulty in understanding and using problem-solving strategies. A student in your class may be affected by a learning disability related to memory if they have difficulty learning and remembering information, or if they have difficulty with working memory, which is the section of our memory which helps us to keep information in mind while we're using that information to complete a task or execute a challenge. And perhaps my favorite, because I think that so many students with learning disabilities are often referred to as disorganized, unmotivated, or lazy. However, organizational skills may be a true deficiency for a student that is dealing with a learning disability in their life. Indicators that a student in your classroom may be working alongside a learning disability in their organizational skills include difficulty organizing and keeping track of their personal belongings and schoolwork, difficulty organizing and allotting the right amount of time to complete their assignments, and difficulty keeping track of due dates for their assignments. As of this point, we've largely focused on what learning disabilities are, what learning disabilities are not, as well as the cognitive and learning characteristics of individuals that may have a learning disability. But it is important to remember that a learning disability does not only affect cognition and learning, but affects many dimensions of an individual's life and throughout their life. So since learning and cognition are not the only parts of life, that leads us to the social and emotional dimensions of learning disabilities. Since learning disabilities are lifelong, students may experience several negative social and emotional experiences as they grow, such as not being invited to play or not being included in group activities as often, having fewer friends, and difficulty with teachers. Adults with learning disabilities may experience difficulties with employment and in social relationships, such as being a roommate, spouse, or parent. Social behavior. Students with learning disabilities may be described as having negative or inappropriate behaviors, such as acting aggressively, demonstrating negative verbal and nonverbal behaviors, and a lack of skills in beginning and maintaining positive social relationships. They may also be described as withdrawn, disruptive, helpless, less cooperative, insensitive, less tactful, attention-seeking, more active, and immature. Students with learning disabilities may have difficulty completing tasks or following directions. Communicative competence. Students with learning disabilities may demonstrate shortfalls in conversation across settings. Students with learning disabilities may experience difficulties in topic selection, initiation and maintenance of conversation, conversational turn-taking, asking for and giving clarification, telling stories, sharing logical opinions and different points of view, appropriate gaze and eye contact, being tactful, and understanding humor and slang. Social information processing and social cognition. Students with learning disabilities may have decreased social perception and or nonverbal perception. They may have difficulty making emotional or feeling judgments without verbal cues from others. Students with learning disabilities may experience more difficulties in social problem solving. Self-concept. Students with learning disabilities are likely to perceive themselves more negatively than their peers on measures of academic self-concept. However, social self-concept may vary depending on individual and situational factors. Emotions. Negative emotions adversely affect memory and information processing. Students with learning disabilities are more likely than their peers to experience negative emotions such as depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Poor emotional regulatory skills may interfere with social cue coding and identifying multiple perspectives.